Hi there. My name is Naomi Rodgers, and I'm an assistant professor at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, where I also direct the Stuttering Lab. Earlier this month, a couple weeks ago, I did a speaker series at AIS on some of my recent research that explores the relationship between stuttering and cognitive bias. In case you weren't able to make it to that event, I am recording a brief summary of the content that we talked about, as well as some discussion points that were really enlightening to all of us as we engage in some really wonderful discussion about this topic. So I'm going to start by just providing a little bit of background on the topic of cognitive bias. So what is it? Cognitive bias is the tendency to prioritize things in your environment that align with what you expect to find. So we all go about our everyday lives with a certain worldview or perspective, and we tend to look for things around us that kind of support or are in line with what we are expecting to find in our environment and the world around us. And so there are lots of different types of cognitive bias. There are many dozens out there that have been studied and documented. And these different types of cognitive bias have been shown to impact how we feel about ourselves as well as the world around us. And so I'm going to just summarize three of the big ones, like the three cognitive biases that have garnered a lot of attention among researchers, particularly in the field of cognitive science. So one type of cognitive bias is known as interpretation bias. Interpretation bias is when a person attributes negative meaning to an ambiguous social scenario. So for example, let's say as you are ordering at a restaurant, you notice that the server is tapping their foot and looking around. So that part is underlined because that is an ambiguous social cue. We don't know why they are tapping their foot and looking around. You assume that the server is getting frustrated with you, that it's taking extra time for you to order. Okay, so this might be an experience that people who stutter encounter quite often. Maybe not now in the pandemic when we're not really eating out, but this is a common experience I think a lot of folks who stutter experience. Okay, so the tendency to draw these negative interpretations or these negative conclusions from an ambiguous social cue is known as having a negative interpretation bias. Another type of cognitive bias is known as memory bias. So this can occur in one of two ways. One type of memory bias is when you remember an event in a more negative way than how it actually happened, or it could be that you remember a negative event more quickly than you're able to remember a benign event. Okay, so to put this into perspective from the stuttering experience, here are some examples. So for the first one, perhaps you gave a presentation at work and afterwards you thought that you stuttered a lot more in the presentation than you actually did. That's one form of memory bias. Another example might be that you recall that time that you stuttered a lot in a work presentation more quickly than remembering another time when you gave a presentation and you are more fluent. Okay, and so those are two examples of how memory bias can play out for folks who stutter. And a third type of cognitive bias that I have spent most of my time researching is known as attentional bias. And this is when folks pay more attention to negative social cues in their environments rather than benign cues. So for a stuttering example, let's say as you introduce yourself to some new people at a party, you stutter on your name and you notice that someone gives you the look. Okay, we all know what that look is. Perhaps the person kind of lifts their eyebrows a little bit, or gets really shifty in their facial expressions, or whatever it is. You notice that the person that you're talking to um, notices that you stuttered, and it gives a look of some sort. Okay, so folks who have a negative attentional bias might be particularly tuned into those negative social cues, as opposed to focusing on more neutral or positive social cues around them. And so an example of how attentional bias is studied in research labs, oftentimes what we'll do is we'll present a variety of faces on a computer screen, and either by way of asking participants to respond as quickly as they can by pressing specific keys on the keyboard, or w- w- watching their eye movements through an eye tracker, um, we can actually get insight into where folks are paying the most attention. Are they focusing on the more neutral expressions that are presented, or are they focusing more on the negative or socially threatening expressions? Like, this is an expression of fear. Um, and so there are lots of different ways that we can get a small glimpse into how folks kind of interact or attend to these different types of emotional expressions. And so there admittedly has been very, very, very limited work in the area of attentional bias among people who stutter. Um, and so um, what we tend to find in the few studies that have been done is that adults who stutter, particularly, but only those that also have high levels of social anxiety, do tend to have that attentional bias for negative faces. They tend to favor attentional processing of those fearful or angry or disgusted facial expressions as opposed to those neutral expressions. I did a study of attentional bias with adolescents who stutter. So these are young people between the ages of 13 and 19 years old. And what I found was that the adolescents who stutter were really quick to notice the negative emotional expressions, but once they noticed them, they quickly diverted their attention away to look more towards those more neutral expressions. And what's interesting is that this vigilance avoidance pattern where they're quick to identify the negative face, that hypervigilance towards negativity, but then quick avoidance, that pattern of attention was demonstrated by, as a group, all the adolescents who stutter, regardless of how socially anxious they were. Okay. And the control group, so I had 50 teens who stutter and 50 teens who don't stutter. The control group demonstrated um, no attentional bias at all towards negativity. They looked at the neutral faces and negative faces equally. And so you'll also remember that a couple slides ago I mentioned that usually this hyper focus on negative faces tends to be linked to social anxiety. What was so interesting about my findings, and to be honest, really confusing at first, was that it was a group phenomenon that all adolescents who stutter as a group, they tended to look more at these negative faces regardless of how socially anxious they are. And so my interpretation of this is that there's something about the experience of stuttering above and beyond social anxiety that may tune people who stutter into these negative social cues. And so in trying to understand why this might be, it's hard not to think about our experiences with listener reactions. We know that really subtle listener reactions, even if they're not blatantly or overtly negative, even a slight change in the listener's expression, whether again it's an eyebrow raise or they quickly look away or their face or their mouth smirks a little bit, even a really subtle listener reaction can sometimes be construed as a negative listener reaction. And so this was my kind of interpretation or conclusion from that study, was that there's something about the stuttering experience beyond the confines of social anxiety that really tunes folks who stutter into those negative expressions. And I do think that it's linked to our experiences with listener reactions and expecting negative listener reactions in our social interactions. And so at the end of my presentation a couple weeks ago, with the group of folks who stutter that were there, we had a wonderful and lively discussion about the implications of this attentional bias and more broadly cognitive bias on the stuttering experience. or perhaps you can also look at kind of the reverse way. How does our experience with stuttering kind of influence our cognitive biases or attentional biases? And so here are some discussion prompts that we had addressed in our discussion. How often do you notice listener reactions to your stuttering? And then what type of listener reactions do you notice? How do you interpret those listener reactions? What do you tell yourself when you notice them? So do we just stop after we have noticed a potentially negative listener reaction, or is there a narrative that we tell ourselves after we objectively notice that interaction? Okay, are we telling ourselves that the person must think that we're dumb, that we're incompetent, or any other narrative that we tell ourselves once we notice that listener reaction? How do listener reactions affect your communication in the moment? So once you've noticed that the listener has noticed your stuttering in that moment, how does that affect your communication in that interaction? Does it change anything or does it not change anything for you? How have listener reactions affected your communication in the long term? So with repeated experiences with noticing that listeners notice your stuttering, how has that affected your ability to connect with people in the long term, or ability to kind of approach or engage in interactions in a mindful way? What would happen if you always paid attention to listener reactions? Okay. And then also on the flip side of that, what would happen if you never paid attention to listener reactions? And so this, I think, just gets at this idea that we can exercise, like, we do have some choice in terms of what we pay attention to, and then the stories we tell ourselves based on what we pay attention to. And those are important. They can have real world implications on how we feel about ourselves, how we feel about our listeners, how we feel about interactions in general. So maybe these questions are interesting to you, and thinking through them might offer you some insights into your own personal stuttering experience. Thanks so much for listening.